This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and it's yoga time. This is the Lenovo Yoga 900. This is the successor to the Lenovo Yoga 3 Pro. They gave up with that naming convention, and they've changed over to, well, now they have a 900 series. There's a 700 series, which is actually less expensive. This one lives up to the Pro name that it actually doesn't have, though, because those of you who watched our Lenovo Yoga 3 review last year, remember that we were not so sold on it being a Pro machine if it only came with Intel Core M CPUs. This Yoga has Intel Core i5 and Core i7, 6th generation Skylake inside, Intel HD 520 graphics, 13.3-inch display, QHD resolution, nice and high, and of course the usual Yoga design where the keyboard sticks out on the back. Keyboard's a little bit recessed to kind of help with that problem. At 2.8 pounds, so it got a little bit heavier from last year, but that's okay. If we get more power, I'm okay with it. It's still relatively speaking light as a Windows convertible with a 360-degree hinge. So yes, it does the presentation mode, it does the tent mode, it does the, yes, it's a laptop mode. And we're going to look at it now. So here it is, the Lenovo Yoga 900, the fall of 2015 yoga model for the masses. I say for the masses because the yoga line, not to be confused with the ThinkPad yoga line or the ThinkPads, those are your business black Ultrabooks, and the regular yogas were once a member of the IdeaPad family. It's a name that Lenovo has actually dropped, but these are oriented towards consumers, and that means you get some stylish touches, perhaps inspired by Aston Kutcher, who knows, who helped design some of the little doodads on some of Lenovo's products. We do have the watch band hinge being the most stylish part of this laptop, and Lenovo introduced that last year with the Lenovo Yoga 3 Pro, and it's still a nice touch. It's really wild looking, but it works. It's functional, it's held up well, and it's certainly unique looking, but not so big and out there and in your face and causing ergonomic interesting problems like not closing all the way like the Microsoft Surface Book Fulcrum hinge. So folds nice and flat here. You can use this as a tablet. This is a 360-degree convertible. In fact, Lenovo is the one who came up with the idea of this sort of hinge design. You can see it's really pleasingly slim. It's also pretty light at 2.8 pounds. This is one of the lightest 13.3-inch convertible Ultrabooks on the market. It does have a metal casing, or at least metal panels. This is not exactly what you would call a unibody design. It will show you as we open it up and go through all the moves here. So for those of you wondering about how bouncy it is, all of these convertibles have something of a bouncy hinge. Now you got to be poking at it. If you're just using it and typing, even if you're on the bus and the bus bounces a little bit, you can see I'm jiggling it right now. It's not bouncing the display. So not the end of the world, but you know, it's when people poke at it that they notice these things. We have metal here, we have metal here with a painted on finish, and this is a removable bottom panel. It takes 10 Torx T5 screws. That will keep you busy for a little while unscrewing those. You do not have to remove the rubber feet to take it apart, and there are internals accessible. We'll talk about those later, and we'll give you a picture of what the internals look like on it. We have Lenovo's new Yoga logo here, which looks nice like this, but in other lights it looks kind of cheap. It's not, I have an issue with the logo itself, the font or anything like that, but it's just the way they applied it. When it kind of starts to disappear like that, it looks a little bit cheesy, but they decided to be distinctive with their yoga branding, and as long as you get in a high contrast light, it's not too bad looking. Inside we have metal underneath this deck for rigidity, but we've got a soft touch rubbery finish, really rubbery, and that rubbery stuff extends around the sides. Like if you take the bottom panel off, you notice when you're prying away that it's actually quite soft. Now why did they do that? Not just because it's different or because it might feel good in terms of grip on the keyboard deck here, but so if you are using it in something like tent mode, the rubbery edges touch the table, which means it's more stable, less likely to slip. It also won't scratch the table, all sorts of good stuff like that. Machine starts at $1,199, call it $1,200. It's pretty well equipped for that. You get an Intel 6th generation Skylake CPU. That's the 15-watt Core i7-6500. You clocked at 2.5 gigahertz for the base clock speed, so pretty capable. And that has 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of SSD storage inside. It's using an M-SATA drive inside with an M2 connector. Our model is $1,400. It still has that same Core i7, but that gets you 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. That's a pretty generous amount of storage that you get there. Dual band Intel Wi-Fi AC is standard. That's the 8000 series Wi-Fi that Intel's using with Skylake. It comes with Bluetooth as well, 4.0. So the usual nice Ultrabook specs there. A little bit above the average $1,000 price point, but Lenovo figures, hey, you're getting the watch band Hinge there. You're getting a Core i7, so that's pretty fair. Something like the HP Spectre is around $1150 if you're looking at the Core i7 with 8 gigs of RAM and a 256 gig SSD, so it's certainly not out of line in the marketplace. Plus, this one has the QHD display. Now, the QHD display is not my favorite feature. It is a Samsung PLS display, which is IPS, like it uses pentile matrix display. Gone are the problems showing yellows. It used to have kind of murky yellows. That's been fixed. Viewing angles are pretty good. As you can see, there's plenty of reflectivity and glare here, even though this is a 300 nits of brightness panel, which is fairly bright. That's a pretty good brightness spec there. Not up there with Surface Book at 400 nits, but that one is really over the top with brightness. Anyway, it's a very glossy Gorilla Glass on top of this, so yeah, it kind of makes it a little bit hard to see despite the brightness. That is not uncommon, though, so we're not going to harp on that too much. First thing I'm not too thrilled about, look at the size of the bezel here. It's really large. I'm surprised Lenovo didn't fit a 14-inch panel in here because this area particularly is so high. Now, part of the reason is they have to match it to the base of the computer. If they need a certain amount of room for the internals, then, well, the display panel has to be equal in size. But that's why I'm thinking, why couldn't they just put a 14-inch in there? Anyway, 3200 by 1800 resolution. Color gamut is not bad on this. It's 96% of sRGB and 75% of Adobe RGB. For the $1,000 Ultrabook and tablet category, usually we see 99% of sRGB, but between 96 and 99%, that's really not hugely significant. And the 75% of Adobe RGB is bone standard unless you're looking at more of a specialty device, something like the Vio Z Canvas, which is considerably more expensive too, but that gets you full Adobe RGB coverage. What I'm not too excited about is the black levels and the contrast level on this. We measured contrast ratio at a really unimpressive 300 to 1. Contrast makes things look sharper and clearer, and you would see more detail in the rocks here in this nice pretty picture right there, for example, if the contrast level is higher. And black levels are some of the worst I've seen in a while on a laptop, 1.36. A lot of laptops, again, in the $1,000 price range are 0.36, where lowered numbers are better. That means less light is coming through when you're displaying black. That's why that is. And again, something like the Surface Book, if you're wondering where your money goes when you're paying for something that's more expensive, it had 0.29 for black levels, which is really, really stellar. So it's not a horrible display, but if you're a graphics professional looking to buy this to do some Photoshop production work, video production work, that sort of thing, these could be deal breakers. And for your everyday person who looks at these and has a pretty good eye, you'll probably notice that it's not quite up there with some of the sharper, more contrasty IPS displays out there. But the color is absolutely fine on it. Now, just for comparison, we have, again, it's more expensive, starting at $1,500, Microsoft Surface Book here. And you can see, I think, the difference here. We're displaying, obviously, the same desktop picture. There's a lot more contrast that makes the bright colors in the rocks really pop right there, the oranges and stuff like that. So it's looking nicer, obviously, with this guy here. Of course, you're going to have to spend a lot more money to get that display too, aren't you? Now, there are other alternatives. There's also the HP Spectre X360 that we mentioned, and we have that handy in-house. So we'll be doing a smackdown too. For that one, we have the 1080p display, not the QHD model. So there'll be a slight difference there. So that's why we're not doing a direct comparison of the displays right now. Speaking of the Spectre, here it is with the Spectre, also 13.3 inch with a 360-degree hinge, a little bit more classier design there, but this one is also heavier. This is 3¼ pounds versus 2.8 pounds, so almost a ½ pound heavier, so that's important too. And again, if you folks are interested in the smackdown between these two, give a shout out in the comments and we can make that happen. So how about the keyboard? It's not unlike the Yoga 3 Pro. Not surprisingly, I love ThinkPad keyboards, less so the Yoga keyboards. Now, it's not a terrible keyboard. It just doesn't have as much key travel when you press down there. And the keys feel a little bit more mushy instead of that nice, precise click. But really, it's not a bad keyboard. little bit noisy, not horrible, but not one of my favorites. And it does have backlighting. You'll hit the FN plus the space bar, and that's something we've seen from the ThinkPad days, to turn the backlighting on and off, and it's a fairly effective, pleasing white backlighting that comes up and illuminates around the edges of the keys. Obviously, it's easy to see these keys in any lighting since you have white letter masking on a black background. So decent keyboard, not stunning keyboard, adequate. They've dropped it down. You can see there's a little bit of drop here. I think that's probably so when you lay it flat on the table in yoga mode, the keys are not directly touching, and these keys do not do the lift and lock kind of thing. They don't lock in place, but they are disabled. Whenever you take this out of laptop mode, if you put it in tablet mode or presentation mode, anything like that, they'll be disabled, so you don't have to worry about it. Trackpad right here, lined in a little bit of chrome. Not a bad glass trackpad at all. In fact, lately with these Microsoft Signature Edition laptops, we've been seeing some improvements in trackpads overall. It's not quite up there with Surface Book, which has the most Mac-like trackpad ever, but it's pretty decent. It's pretty responsive. It doesn't do anything weird, which in Windows land means it's pretty good. In terms of ports, we have, yay, we haven't been seeing too much of this yet, but first off, there's a USB 3.1 port, and that is a USB-C form. So for those of you who have been dying to see USB-C, there it is, which is USB 3.1. Now, we've seen a few laptops that have had full-size USB 3.1, which look like USB 3.0 ports, like the MSI GT72 Dominator we recently reviewed, but here's USB-C. SD card slot, the card will stick out part way right there. Regular USB 3.0 port, and this is the charging port, and notice the little notch over here. This can also function as a regular USB port, and it will auto sense. It knows if you've got the notchy kind of connector as extra pins on it, and it will charge. And I'll whip out the charger for you so you can see. And here is that charger connector, so you can see the little extra notch that sticks out over here, and the charger is a fairly compact sort of thing with a relatively thin cord. This is not one of those long laptop chargers. It's a two-piece kind of design. It's about 5 feet long or so, so it's adequate. It's fine. And obviously this is pretty easy to take anywhere. Pretty light, pretty, well, compact. And on the other side we have the power button. They put the power button on the outside so that you can actually access it if you happen to have it in tablet mode. And we've got our Novo button, as it's called. That's the Lenovo recovery function built in right there. Rotation lock, your headphone jack, and another USB 3.0 port. Notice there's no mini display port, there's no HDMI. If you want to do display out, well, it would be the USB-C to HDMI or USB-C to DisplayPort adapter in that case. Modern times. So how about performance? Well, this is a dual-core Core i7 inside, and it benchmarks not unlike other Skylake Intel 6th generation Core i7 dual-core CPUs on the market, which there aren't a whole lot yet because this is still pretty new, but here you can see we scored 2697 in PC Mark 8. That is the home accelerated test. For 3D Mark 11, now this has just Intel HD 520 integrated graphics, so don't expect amazing numbers here. 1857 on the performance test, and on the extreme test, 426. That shows notable improvements over 5th generation Broadwell, which is, Intel didn't put a whole lot of extra oomph into Skylake versus Broadwell for the CPU, but they did put a little good mojo in there when it came to integrated graphics, and that shows in these tests. Computed pi in 16 seconds using W prime, which is improved over around 19 seconds for 5th generation Broadwell. Geekbench 3, the single-core result, 3163. The multi-core was 6,778. So reasonable scores there, about what we would expect. Now for the SSD drive, you can see our Crystal Disk Mark results here for the 512 gig. This one happened to have a Samsung. They use Lite-On, they use Hynix, they use a couple of different brands in here. I don't really think it's going to matter a whole lot which it is. Note that this is a M2 slot, and they are using an M-SATA interface drive, not the faster PCIe. So that's actually a pretty decent set of numbers there for an M-SATA SSD drive. It's not going to set the world on fire compared to PCIe, but it's decent enough. And honestly, unless you move big files all the time, you probably won't notice so much, maybe a little bit quicker launch times if you had something that was PCIe or even faster non-volatile memory kind of SSD drive. It's pretty decent though. Inside, the SSD drive is socketed. Again, it's an M2 slot on that, and RAM is soldered on board, so you will not be upgrading it yourself afterward. The wireless card is also socketed. However, that's a pretty good Intel wireless card. You probably won't want to. Like I said, to open this up, remove 10 Torx T5 screws and then pry the bottom off. The plastic clips are pretty firm, so don't be afraid to work it around. It's easier if you start at the front end and work your way back, and once you get it off, the whole thing pops up, and we'll throw in a slide so you can see what the internals look like. And the 66 watt-hour 4-cell battery takes up a whole lot of the space inside, not like most Ultrabooks these days. So we're happy to see a good capacity battery in here, and Lenovo claims that up to 9 hours use on a charge, which is actually, ironically, an improvement over the Core M version in the Yoga 3 Pro, which didn't have very good battery life, but Core M doesn't always have better battery life. So how does it do for battery life with Lenovo claiming up to 9 hours? Well, you know, if you were doing almost nothing with it and set the brightness to 20%, which would be kind of dim, maybe you could, but we're averaging 6.5, 7 hours, and that's with brightness set at 40%, which is usable, and I wouldn't want to go a whole lot darker if I was in office lighting. Wi-Fi on and active in our usual mix of real-life productivity tests include MS Office, editing some images in Adobe Photoshop, streaming an hour episode on Netflix, and playing some music in the background and doing a little social networking. If you're going to be playing games on this, obviously it's not going to last quite as long. If you're going to be editing HD video on this, it's going to shorten the battery life because it's going to be working harder. Speaking of which, it's a Core i7 dual core, so it is capable of editing 1080p video in Windows Movie Maker or Premiere, whatever it is you like, and it's perfectly just fine for Photoshop too, even with the integrated graphics, and that's with, say, a TIFF file that has 10 layers that was based on a 24 meg raw file taken from a digital SLR. So that's a pretty good, tough use case for it. It's fast enough to compile code for those who want to program. And for those of you who are students and who are doing CAD, it's fine. Obviously, if you're a professional CAD worker, you know by now that you really need a mobile workstation, ideally with a quad-core CPU and a graphics card designed for that if you're going to be using that as your main machine for doing CAD work, of course. If you're just doing it occasionally, different story. If you're doing it for school, it's fine. Heat and noise. It gets warm, it does not get hot. Lenovo did a very good job of dissipating the heat here. There are 2 fans inside, as you saw in that slide that we spliced in of the internals. You will hear the fan when it's working hard. If you are doing something like editing 1080p video on this or playing a game, you could play Skyrim on this, certainly at 720p in low settings, Tomb Raider, those sort of games. Even you could push it and do GTA 5 if you're okay with 720p in the lowest possible settings. It's better than nothing, right? Not too noisy. These are not air intakes, by the way. These are the speakers. These have down-firing speakers here, and all the ventilation happens beneath the watch band hinge. It's all nicely concealed. You can barely see them there, but there's vent, 4 vent openings right there. So reasonably quiet, reasonably cool running, a little bit cooler than the Spectre, whose metal chassis conducts heat a little bit more than the thinner metal panels on this. Now, compared to something like Surface Book's brains are actually in the tablet section, the top half, so that's never against your lap. You won't be feeling it at all, but that dissipates heat pretty well too, and is fairly quiet. Alright, so how does it look for playing back video, and how is the speaker volume? By the way, this has a top row of multimedia control keys right up here, so no need to press the FN button to actually use those for brightness control, volume control, the usual kind of stuff. Let's look at our smackdown between Surface Pro 4 and Surface Book to test out video playback. And we're using the Microsoft Edge web browser for better or worse. It renders really beautifully. It is a little bit of a resource hog with some bugs, but just so you know which browser we're using. For Mobile Tech Review, and you knew this one was coming.
Looks good, yeah.
This is the comparison or smackdown between the new Microsoft Surface Book right here and the Microsoft Surface Pro 4. Now, this one isn't so much a smackdown. I mean, so even when we raise it to 90%, 96% volume, it didn't really distort, it didn't sound harsh. It actually didn't get hugely louder either, which is interesting. So it does not get nasty sounding, at least, as the Plus. And the color saturation is pretty pleasing here, despite the low contrast and stuff. Like I said, it's a pretty enjoyable display that we've got here. But for $1,200 to $1,400, you know, I just like to see the very best that you can get, hopefully. Maybe the Surface Book is the new bar that tells us just how much you're going to have to pay to get that very best stuff. I don't know. So that's the Lenovo Yoga 900. It's available now, again, starting with Core i7 options. There aren't any Core i5s on the market. At this point, they'll probably come. $1,200 to $1,400, fairly well-equipped machine, and it's a very nice machine, but we like how light it is. The watch band hinge is still pretty, it's novel, it's stable, it seems to be durable. The last few years are still holding up very well. It's nice that you can get this in a couple of colors. I love that clementine orange that's still around. There's a gold option. The display is not my favorite. I mean, yes, there are a lot worse displays, but for something that's $1,200 and up, I would have liked to have seen more contrast and better black levels on this display to really make me ooh and ah. For graphic design folks, it probably won't be your first pick just due to that display, but for everybody else out there, it's a pleasing display. It's a nice light laptop. It doesn't get too hot. It gets the job done. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to visit our website for the full written review and hit that like button.